What if the most important military conversation of World War II never happened in a war room, never happened over a map table covered in battle plans, and never involved the generals everyone expected, but instead unfolded years later in a quiet exchange between two presidents, about a man who was already dead? What if the real story of how George S. Patton changed orders mid-operation, defying the chain of command in one of the most audacious acts of military history, was never fully told until Harry Truman looked Dwight Eisenhower in the eye and said something that silenced the room? This is not a story about medals or monuments. This is a story about power, ego, genius, and the terrifying cost of being right when everyone above you is wrong. If this kind of story moves you, the kind that changes how you see history, subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know before watching. Your engagement keeps stories like this alive. It was the winter of 1944, and the Western Front was collapsing in ways that no Allied planner had dared to predict. On December 16, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Autumn Mist, what the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, sending more than 200,000 German soldiers crashing through the frozen Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack was designed to split the Allied lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviet Union could complete its advance from the east. American units were surrounded, communications were severed, and an entire division was encircled at a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun, France, on December 19, 1944, a date that would become one of the most consequential in the entire war. The generals around the table wore expressions of controlled panic. All except one. George Smith Patton Jr. arrived at that Verdun meeting like a man who had already decided what history was going to look like. He was the commanding general of the Third Army, a figure so theatrical and so ferociously competent that even his enemies, American and German alike, could not look away from him. When Eisenhower asked his generals how long it would take to turn a force 90 degrees and relieve the surrounded troops at Bastogne, most commanders hedged. They spoke of logistics, of frozen roads, of supply lines stretched to breaking point. Patton did not hedge. He looked at Eisenhower and said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Eisenhower, who had known Patton for decades, thought he was joking. Patton was not joking. He had already issued the preliminary orders, before the meeting even began. This is the moment that rewrites everything you thought you knew about military command. Patton had not waited for permission. On the morning of December 19, before he ever entered that conference room in Verdun, he had telephoned his own staff back at 3rd Army headquarters and issued a series of coded instructions. 3 contingency plans had already been prepared, each one corresponding to a different attack direction Eisenhower might authorize. The moment Patton received confirmation of which axis Eisenhower approved, his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, would give the order and the entire 3rd Army would begin its turn northward. Patton had changed the orders before the orders existed. He had reorganized an army of 250,000 men, pivoted their direction of advance by 90 degrees in the middle of an ongoing operation, and set them in motion, all within a window that military historians still struggle to fully comprehend. This was not improvisation. This was a level of pre-planning so far beyond standard doctrine that it bordered on insubordination, and it saved thousands of lives. To understand why Patton was able to think this way, you have to go back further, back to North Africa in 1943, back to the humiliation of Kasserine Pass in February of that year, where American forces suffered one of their worst defeats of the entire war at the hands of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was after Kasserine that Eisenhower gave Patton command of the demoralized II Corps, and it was there that Patton's philosophy of aggressive, continuous, psychologically overwhelming movement first proved itself at scale. Patton believed, genuinely, almost religiously, that speed itself was a weapon. That hesitation killed more soldiers than bullets. That an army in motion was an army alive. By the time the Third Army was activated in August 1944 and Patton was given command during the breakout from Normandy, his operational instincts had been refined into something almost supernatural in their precision. He swept across France at a pace that left even his admirers breathless, liberating more territory in less time than any other commander in the theater. But Patton's relationship with authority was never simple. In August 1943, the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, where Patton struck 2 soldiers he accused of cowardice at field hospitals on August 3 and August 10, had nearly ended his career. Eisenhower had considered relieving him of command entirely. General Omar Bradley, who had served under Patton and then effectively surpassed him in the command hierarchy, urged restraint. The press, led by correspondent Drew Pearson who broke the story in November 1943, turned the incident into a national scandal. Patton was forced into a long, humiliating silence, used as a decoy to mislead the Germans about where the D-Day invasion would land, kept away from real command while lesser men held authority he believed was rightfully his. The psychological weight of those months never left him. When he finally got his army in 1944, he drove it, and himself, with the fury of a man who understood that time and opportunity were finite, and that the world would not wait for the cautious. Now, if you have made it this far into this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Someone who wants the truth behind the history, not just the highlights. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, like this video to help more people find it, share it with a friend who deserves to know what really happened at Bastogne, and leave a comment below. Tell us what details surprised you most so far because the most important part of this story is still coming. The relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, when elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement and reached the surrounded 101st Airborne Division, became one of the defining images of American military history. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defenders of Bastogne, had famously replied, "Nuts," to a German demand for surrender on December 22, a response that became legendary. But the men who made that defiance survivable were the soldiers of the Third Army, moving through ice and snow and artillery fire at a pace that German commanders described as impossible. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, later admitted that the speed of Patton's movement was the single factor that most surprised German high command during the entire Ardennes offensive. They had not believed it was physically possible. Patton had not only changed orders mid-operation, he had changed what military operations were believed to be capable of. The conversation between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower about Patton did not happen in a dramatic setting. It happened in the complex, layered context of two men who had both been shaped by Patton's legacy in ways they were still processing years after his death. Patton died on December 21, 1945, exactly 1 year and 5 days after the relief of Bastogne that he had made possible, from complications following a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, on December 9 of that year. He never wrote the full memoir he intended. He never testified before Congress. He never gave the unfiltered account of what he had actually done and why. What remained were his diaries, his letters, and the memories of the men who served with him and above him, men like Eisenhower, who carried the weight of commanding a genius he could never fully control, and Truman, who had become president in April 1945 and inherited a world that Patton had helped shape but would never live to see settled. When Eisenhower, by then a presidential candidate in 1952, spoke about Patton's actions in the Ardennes, Truman reportedly said something that captured the essential tragedy of George Patton with devastating precision. Truman, who was famously direct in ways that Washington rarely rewarded, had his own complicated view of military genius and civilian authority. He had fired Douglas MacArthur in April 1951 for insubordination, a decision that cost him enormous political capital but which he defended without apology until his last days. When the question of Patton's mid-operation order changes came up, specifically the pre-authorized contingency planning that had allowed Patton to move before Eisenhower had formally given the word, Truman is reported to have said, in his characteristic plain-spoken way, that Patton had done what every great commander does. He had solved tomorrow's problem today and the Army's job was to be glad he did, not to count how many rules he bent to do it. Truman understood insubordination in the way that only someone with genuine executive authority can, not as a breach of protocol, but as a question of whether the man bending the rules was right. Patton, at Bastogne, had been right in the most absolute sense history allows. What makes this story endure, what makes it matter beyond the battles and the dates and the names on the maps, is the question it forces every generation to ask about leadership, about genius, and about the rules that govern both. Patton was not a comfortable man to command, to serve under, or to admire. He was vain, profane, difficult, and frequently wrong about things that had nothing to do with moving armies across frozen ground. He was also, in the specific and irreplaceable way that history demands of certain figures at certain moments, exactly the right man in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne who heard the sound of 4th Armored Division's tanks breaking through the German lines on December 26, 1944, did not know about contingency plans or pre-authorized orders or command conference dynamics in Verdun. They knew that someone had come for them. They knew that the Army had not left them behind. That is what Patton's preemptive order changing made real, not a tactical victory on a map, but a human promise kept at the edge of survival. History does not always belong to the men who followed the rules. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who understood, at the deepest level, what the rules were actually designed to protect, and acted to protect those things before anyone gave them permission. George Patton looked at a frozen, desperate battlefield in December 1944 and made a decision that the regulations of war said he should not have made. Harry Truman, looking back at that moment from the long perspective of the presidency, understood it for what it was, not insubordination but an act of command so complete that it transcended the systems designed to govern it. If this story changed the way you think about history, leadership, or the price of genius, subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story about what real courage and real command actually look like, and leave a comment below telling us what part of this story hit you the hardest, because these conversations are how history stays alive, and your voice is part of that.